Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Dee is going to do the summary this time around. Welcome to our Lymond Book Club Part 2. And we have a special guest star, Philippe, who also is joining us and is reading the books for the first time.
Yes, I have absolutely no experience with them, so Dee and Laura thought it might be a good idea to bring somebody in who has had no introduction to them. So, but I am caught up with everyone else. So,
Awesome. Okay, so in a very quick summary of what we're looking at this week, the first chapter we read is Blindfold Play. And what happens is a body sort of washes up at, is it Ballad Castle?
Yeah.
Castle? So I'm going to be checking in on my pronunciations. Ostensibly a young English boy. We soon find out that's not who it is, but he's sort of described initially as a boy and young and English. Christian Stewart and her, I'm guessing it's kind of her man, a servant in the castle who reports to her, Simon Bogle, the bodyguard, finds him, and they sort of bring him in the castle and in secret because they don't want, what's his name? They do not want Hugh to find him because they think if Hugh finds him, he's going to kill him immediately. And Christian and Syme are hoping they can get some ransom out of this kid. So they sort of nurse him back to health. And as soon as he wakes up, he's sort of charming and articulate and clearly Lymond, even though we're not supposed to know that. It's pretty obvious that it's him immediately. Which kind of knocks back a little bit to our discussion last week on how he's sort of described really differently. And so this description of him as like a young English boy, I thought was a nice continuation of that. He's got amnesia, so he doesn't remember who he is initially. And then they sort of go back and forth. There's a nice little give and take between him and Christian. Christian is clearly portrayed as smart and competent and all of that. At one point he's singing a song, I think. Let's see, where did I put my notes? Yeah, they're singing together, and then he sings a song that I learned as a child as Froggy Winnacourtin. It has a little bit different lyrics in the book, but I'm guessing it's the same song. And he gets to like halfway through the second verse and remembers who he is. And let's see, Tom Erskine shows up. Oh, he wants to know where Jonathan Crouch is, and she doesn't know. Tom Erskine shows up. They kind of hustle him out of the castle. And let's see. She says that she'll try and find out where Jonathan Crouch is, and he kind of accuses her of telling him stories to keep him around by referencing Scheherazade. And then we get to chapter 3, more blind play. The Queen moves too far, where we are at Stirling. Erskine and Christian Stewart have gone to Stirling. And Christian figures out that Douglas has Crouch. These are a lot of names of people that I don't know who they are. So, but Henry Douglas has Crouch. So there's a discussion of Will Scott with his father. And I love that his father explicitly says that Will not betray Lymond, which I think is another bit of foreshadowing that he's definitely going to betray Lymond at some point. But we don't know that. Lymond's mother is, have we moved places? We moved a lot of places. It gets a little unclear where everyone is.
I think we're still in Stirling.
Are we? Because Erskine says he's going somewhere, and then we end up with Lymond's mother, Sibylla. Are we still at Stirling? I got confused about that. There's a little exchange that makes it clear that Richard's wife, Lymond's brother Richard, his wife Marietta is bored with him and thinks Lymond is more interesting. That takes up about a whole page of the book, so I thought, that's interesting. And then we have a whole bit where we learn that the young queen, who seems to be about 4 or 5 years old, had a little adventure where she encountered a man who seemed to be very nice to her, but her nurse freaked out and started screaming, and then the Dowager Queen, there's a whole thing about, was she getting kidnapped? She wasn't. The man who was very nice to her ended up to be Lymond. The young queen encountered him because he was sneaking into the area to talk to Christian, because she'd sent him a note that said she knew where Jonathan Crouch was. He's with Douglas. And they have a little exchange, and then he leaves. That's the end of the chapter.
So I have some stuff.
Highlights? I don't know.
That was perfect. And you did better than a lot of people, because some people get really stuck on like, wait, was that Will Scott or was that Lymond? And you knew it was not.
Holy Lymond. Oh my gosh.
Almost immediately. She doesn't make it too hard to figure out that it's Lymond, even though his name is never specifically dropped in either of those chapters as him being the prisoner.
I am sort of going on the assumption that if there is an attractive, witty, smart, sarcastic guy, it's Lymond. Unless there's some sort of indication that it's not, but yeah.
I have a couple of things to share, like pictures of the places and some fan art.
Cool.
So I'll share them quickly. I have not been to any of these places. I was supposed to go to Scotland this year, and then like the world ended, so I did not. So I've never been to the borders of Scotland, but this is where Boghall was. So it was a real castle, but it's long gone. And there's all these pictures of it. And there's actually, it was standing in the late 1700s. And so this is a drawing someone did of it in the late 1700s, where you can see it a little bit better, but apparently it's pretty much all gone now. But there's Boghall.
But that would be the moat where Lymond sort of washes up with a concussion.
Yeah, well, where Sam
right beside it ish. Okay.
And then this is Stirling Castle, which is still standing. So there's all these pictures. It's like a tourist attraction in Scotland, so you could actually go to Stirling, which would be cool. I haven't been there though. And apparently it has all kinds of cool stuff inside too. Just some pictures. And then here is the Lake of Menteith, which is where the little queen was hiding out. And actually, like the first thing you see on the website about it is that it was once a refuge for Mary, Queen of Scots as a child. And then it was in the Lake of Menteith where the Priory of Inchmahome was, which is the priory where Lymond was in disguise as a monk and hung out with the little queen. So this is still a place you can go. And then these are also real historical figures. So here's Marie de Guise, Mary Queen of Scots' mother, the Dowager Queen.
The one freaking out about the little girl.
Freaking out about her daughter, yeah.
So if her daughter gets kidnapped, she's screwed, so.
Well, yeah, exactly. The English are coming to take her daughter, so understandably, she's a little pissed.
And paranoid.
Yeah. And then I couldn't find a baby Mary Queen of Scots, but here's her as a teenager. She's a girl. And then some fan art, which is fun. Actually, so there's fan art of the previous chapters that I didn't show last time that I found while I was looking for art of these chapters.
Okay.
So I thought I would show it. This one is the scene with Lymond and Sibylla, which I thought was clever. This is by Languish Lochtanel on Tumblr. And then here's one of Lymond and Marietta at that scene from Striped Rose and Sketchpads on Tumblr. And here is, this one I thought is a really clever thing to make a fan art of.
Oh, I like that.
This is the Europe poised over a new board kind of chess scene where like this is by Languish Lochtanel on Tumblr again. She draws like, Henry VIII and Francois I and like English and Scottish fighting. It's super clever.
Yeah.
And then from this chapter, here is Christian Stewart by Bellaro. Here is Christian Stewart by Striped Rose and Sketchpads. Here is Christian and Lymond when he has amnesia by Bellaro. Here is Lymond and the Little Queen, also by Bellaro. And then this isn't fan art, this is jumping ahead to a quote, but I thought it was really funny, was there's the scene where Christian is like, she's like feeling who Lymond is, and she, there's a quote that's like, what to Sim was an English magnifico, ripe for ransom, took bear-like, a different shape under the hyper-tactile fingers, the shape of an unconscious boy. I was like, what the hell does bear-like mean? And it apparently in the Middle Ages, going back to like Roman times, there was this belief that bears are born shapeless and their mothers lick them into shape, which you can find on this medieval bestiary website. And so that's why bear-like, he takes the shape of something else under her fingers.
Huh.
Cool.
All right.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I just had a question in general about the first chapter you read, part 2 of chapter 1. I wasn't too sure that he really had amnesia, or if it all isn't some sort of ploy that he's doing to try and get information about where Jonathan Crouch is. Like, I think there was obviously an injury, because it pretty much states, you know, that there was a wound. So somehow he was injured, but I didn't get the amnesia part at all. I thought he was just sort of play acting.
I thought that too, except for one line made me think that he really did have amnesia, which is, I don't know if we have the same book, but mine's at the bottom of page 69. At the end of the song, the Froggy Goes a Courtin' song, it says he gets like to the end of a line in the song and he's not finished with the song. And it says, the break was as violent as if death itself had struck. The 4 strings gasped once under clenched fingers, and there was silence. And then, alone with the hammering of her heart, with infinite patience, Christian waited. Memory is a strange thing. And so it's like he had sort of like something sparked it. It seemed like he had a physical reaction to his memory coming back, and maybe he faked it. It's totally possible.
I think this is one of the most important questions, because if you take this book as a mystery, and the mystery is who is Lymond, you've had the first 2 chapters where he's this horrible, horrible person, and then you've had these 2 chapters where he's this adorable, charming person. So if his amnesia is real, it leaves this idea that who he is underneath it all is actually this adorable, charming person. But if he's faking the amnesia, which you don't know 100% he isn't, then he just goes to prove like what a shit he is, that he's manipulating this sweet blind woman. And I don't think you know enough to say 100% for sure. He could have faked that moment for Christian's benefit.
Right.
So I think she like leaves it ambiguous on purpose, because it would kind of give away the end of the mystery.
Yeah.
Now, I know this is the first time that they've met in the book that we've read. Is this actually the first time these 2 characters have met in
Oh, that's a good question.
the entire narrative? Like, maybe they've met previously in something that happened before the narrative of the book begins?
I assume they hadn't, because her memory for voices is so good. Like, she says, there's at least a couple times where someone says, like, will you remember his voice? And she's only heard someone speak like 2 lines, and she's like, oh yeah, I'll remember them. Which seems to indicate that she would remember someone's voice pretty accurately.
Well, that also then raises the question of, Scotland's not that big and they're kind of neighbors. How do we know that she doesn't remember his voice?
So she knows, so it might be that she knew who he was the whole time.
I think there's an interesting question also raised in this chapter of why does she go out of her way to help him so much?
Yeah. So I wasn't paying close enough attention to see if is the narrator that unreliable? Is it from her?
Dorothy Dunnett is the most unreliable narrator ever. I'll just throw that out there.
No, but I mean, are we ever in her perspective? Or is it always an omniscient, unreliable narrator?
I feel like we get characters' perspectives, but we don't always get everything that they're thinking.
We're definitely getting her thoughts in a few places. Like, exquisitely done, my young man, thought Christian. She said aloud, well, to begin with, you were right. Interesting. No, like it says, okay, this is the top of 62. It was, thought Christian, fully awake and gripped with laughter, like attending a birth. Were they wrong? And he was Scottish, a purebred Orthodox achievement with full honors, all well? So that seems to, if she's thinking that, then she doesn't know.
But that's before he talks. That's before he wakes up.
Oh, you're right. It is before he wakes up.
I also don't think you know enough to know for sure at this point. But I think what's interesting is, why does she help him? And I think there's a few potential reasons. I like the part, I like the things they have in common. Like, she, like him, is an independent thinker. But she has obviously a strong moral core. And she says, there's a line she says, I've been wrong politically, legally, conventionally, in every other way in judgments before, but these always seem to me the more irrelevant aspects of human decency. Like, she doesn't care what the law says about him or what conventional morality would say. Something else is making her,
it's right or wrong.
Yeah, making her want to help him.
Mm-hmm. I actually am finding that so far, we're still very early in the book, but I think she's become my favorite character.
Oh yeah, she's the only one I like so far. Yeah. I still don't really like Lymond, like, mainly because I just don't know him. Mm-hmm. And it's like, he seems charming, and interesting. I think he's interesting, but I have no sympathy for him yet. But Christian, I do. She's the only one that I'm like, oh, I like her. I want to see more of her. Everybody else is like, eh.
I also keep wanting to call her Christian Shaw and have to
me too.
Christian Shepherd, which is something else completely different. But
yeah, I agree.
Else from this Christian.
And in my head, I was spelling Stewart wrong, which is weird when I actually read it on the page. I was spelling it Stuart. Because I was taking notes, and I'm like, wait a second, that's the wrong spelling of Stewart. But, yeah, okay, so any other historical meanings? We mentioned this earlier before we started recording, but Lymond referring to her as Scheherazade was interesting. Like, because he's implying that she's manipulating him by offering this information about Jonathan Crouch, and that he's on to her. He's like, oh, I see what you're doing. And by calling her Scheherazade, that's what he's saying. And then, but clearly he goes in, like, she sends him a note and he comes when she sends the note. And then when Simon asks, like, well, who's Scheherazade? And she answers, a far-sighted lady who kept the Shah on a leading rein by telling him stories.
Well, and not only that, but then Simon asks her what that has to do with her, and she says nothing, of course.
Yeah. Don't be a fool. There's no connection, when obviously there's a connection. And like Scheherazade, like for Lymond to call her that is a huge compliment, because that character is so, like, her defining characteristic is that she's super smart. And like, that's what her, like, she uses her brain to get out of this very dangerous situation by telling stories and all of that. And that's kind of her defining characteristic. And so the fact that Lymond calls her that I found that super interesting.
I think their whole relationship is really interesting, because they shouldn't, in many ways, they shouldn't like each other, but they're like drawn to each other despite that. So I think the reason he calls her that is also that, so first of all, she offers him information about Crouch and he says no, and then she says, well, it'll be there whether if you come and get it. So of course he does. And then at the end of the third chapter, the last chapter we read, he tries to tell her who he is and she refuses. Yeah. And she says, keep keep sending news of yourself to me. So she keeps giving him reasons to stay in touch with her, and he says he will. And then if you take his amnesia as genuine and that he's not manipulating her, then he really is trying to, like, even though he really wants this information, he's trying not to take advantage of her. And then of course if if his amnesia is fake and he's manipulating her, then he's stringing her along like very, very manipulatively to try to seem honorable, but keep giving her reasons to stay in touch and help him.
But wouldn't his amnesia have ended at the point where he figured, like...
Yeah, but I mean, there's like two interpretations of the scene. If he's manipulating her or if he's not manipulating her.
Right. But, like, he could be manipulating her up until the point where he fakes that he figures out who he is, and then be having some sort of, I should stop manipulating this lady, so I'm going to pretend to remember who I am. Which is pretty early in their interaction. So, like, even if he was faking the amnesia, it seems like he, like, I don't really care. It doesn't seem that manipulative, honestly. I do think that he was genuinely had amnesia. I'm not going to be real strong on that opinion, but I think so. But if Christian is faking not knowing who he is, then that's interesting, that her whole don't tell me who you are, but she knows who he is anyway.
Yeah, why does she say don't tell me who you are?
I thought that was super strange, because it was, she does this whole thing. Where did it go? Okay, let me find the quote. Okay, no, I don't want to know. There was, for the first time, a weary distaste in his voice. But you require to know, you must see that, this secret, the queen's hiding place. Have you betrayed it? Will you betray it? No. Then leave me ignorant. So Christian, and I underlined this next bit. What would make matters easier for your conscience might make them insupportable for mine. Which, if she does know who he is super manipulative on her part, because there's no, like, if she already knows who he is, then there's no insupportable aspect of it at all, because she already knows. So the whole, I prefer to be selfish, God knows I've been wrong, which you just already read, God knows I've been wrong politically, legally, conventionally, and every other way, and judged it before, da-da-da-da. You are at least Scottish, I think? Yes. And in trouble. Well, I'm human. I don't want conscience money in the form of secrets, not just now, thank you. But the day you genuinely want help, I'll be proud to have your confidence. Till then, show your thanks if you wish to by letting me have news of you sometimes. Yeah, I kind of want her to not know who he is, because otherwise I think she's super sketchy. I want her to not be super sketchy.
Well, let's talk about what we learn about both of them by their interactions. I think there's two things that they have in common, like literature, the way they, you know, he's always spewing these quotes, and everybody around him is like, what the fuck is he talking about? But she like jumps right in and trades quotes with him, and they finish each other's quotes, and they sort of have this whole like layer of conversation by like referencing things. So it must, like, you have to assume that no matter what each of them is doing, there's some connection of like, wow, someone like me, you know. It's like when you meet your nerd kindred and you can understand their references all of a sudden. And then the other thing is music, and the music part is really interesting because she's blind, so music is this whole world for her, like, that she loves. And then for him, as he's doing the music, there's also these indications that one, is something he's really comfortable with, but two, it's where he starts to get his memory back. He starts to like talk openly about Crouch as he's playing music. When she asks him, like, it gets his defenses down, and then the moment that his memory comes back is when he's singing that song about the frog. And so it does, again, it just raises this like, why do they like each other? What is their connection? It seems so based on music and literature, and it's really adorable.
Yeah. It is. I mean, I like them. There was a quote where so just things like I like her, how sassy she is, where so there's a point where Syme says they're talking about whether to tell Hugh that he's there, and he says and by that time like they're waiting for him to wake up, and Syme says, and by that time Hugh might be feeling more like himself. And Christian replies, I find the resemblance to himself at the present moment quite startling, but never mind, go on. just like these little bits of, no, this is really who he is.
She actually has a line later, I think, on that same page that was the first time in this book that I've laughed out loud. It's when Lymond is sort of chastising her for saying that he looks like an Englishman. Do I look like an Englishman? And I'm not even sure if this was intentionally written to be a sassy response, but her response is just, I, said Christian with wicked simplicity, am blind. How should I know? Just the way that she answers it. I love that. That's very funny.
Yeah.
I think it does also kind of give you this idea that maybe the reason they both keep finding excuses to like stay in touch is not that they're manipulating each other, but it's just that they like each other and they're both friendly and they need the company of this other person who is like the only other person they've met that
right. Who's not like boring and unread, you know? Like, really, because clearly, like, you get this sense that Richard is kind of a doofus. I mean, he's like clearly like not necessarily a bad guy, he doesn't seem to be, but like he doesn't write his wife, first of all. She hasn't heard from him at all, and so he doesn't seem to be very thoughtful. And then he cares a lot about stuff that is super practical, like super practical, and which, you know, if you're running a castle and a bunch of land and have a bunch of tenants, like that's good. It's not a bad thing to be super practical, but he does not seem to be imaginative in any way. And so you kind of get the sense, like, if Lymond's surrounded by a whole bunch of unimaginative people, that this girl would be like a breath of fresh air, you know, and just
exactly. And probably the same for her. He's a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
The guys are, you know, Richard and Tom Erskine.
I had a couple of questions. I did want to say, I one of the things that just clued me into the fact that this was Lymond was right before he speaks. So when he's been described as like this boy, and you know, he's wearing an English cloak, so I think he's English. Right before he speaks, the descriptive word that Dunnett uses for what he says is resignedly. So it says there's a thin crackle of pillow feather, a stifled expletive, so he swears. Then a voice said resignedly, God, my skull split. And the idea that someone is resigned to me said, okay, this is not a kid. Like, kids do not usually have the emotional state of being resigned to things, you know. So I was like, wait a second, who is this? And that was kind of the, oh, this is Lymond.
An experienced man of the world who's been through a lot, even if he doesn't remember it.
Yeah, Mr. Cynical has washed up on the shore, not a young man. Okay, here's a question for you too that I was I wasn't super confused, but I was trying to put it together from the previous chapters. Okay, so how do you say Buccleuch? Okay, so Buccleuch and Tom are talking about, okay, so they're talking about the English, and they say Tom is talking to Christian when he says, for it was not only good, but miraculous, the news was. Lords Wharton and Lennox, dug deep into Annandale, had turned tail, and pursued by himself and Lord Coulter, that's Richard, right?
Yep.
Lord Coulter, had scampered back to England. scampered back to England with an army. There was a garrison still at Castlemilk, no very great danger, but the deadly thrust north had been stopped. The western arm of the Nutcracker had broken. Why? Overconfidence, we think. They spread a rumor they meant to march north and got a shock when Coulter assumed the opposite and charged in. Made a mess of poor old Annan, but nothing to what Clydesdale missed, thank God. Although I don't mind saying, he added frankly, that Coulter took a chance I wouldn't have touched with a bullhook. But it worked, said Christian, and now, and then he goes on. So my assumption when I read that was that Lymond had somehow manipulated Richard into making this uncharacteristically bold and bizarre choice that Tom clearly was like, I wouldn't have done that, but it worked. So I thought, oh, okay, Lymond did that somehow. So then I went back to the earlier chapter and I was looking at like Lymond's interaction with Richard, where he says, it says, Lymond's voice was absent. Well, Coulter asked him, he says, your services are present with Wharton, I take it. Lymond's voice was absent. Well, he's certainly paying me, which is obviously not an acknowledgement of being on his side, just of taking money.
No acknowledgement that he stole a bunch of his money.
Yeah, he's paying me. He's paying me. Once our friend Bannister reaches Annan, the road north is going to be a little crowded. What's more? And Coulter moved involuntarily. Is the protector then in Stirling? Yes, of course, said Lymond readily. Take care. You asked me a question, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so then he goes on. And then he says, oh, Richard, you haven't packed the ladies off to Stirling for safety, have you? And they go on. Okay, so then when Tom says, overconfidence, we think, they spread a rumor they meant to march north and got a shock when Coulter assumed the opposite. But Lymond said they were going north.
Yeah, Lymond helped spread the rumor that they were going north.
Right, okay, so then he manipulated Richard by obviously lying about the going north thing, which clued Richard into the they're not going north thing. That's what happened.
Yes, Richard did the opposite of what Lymond said would happen because Richard thinks that Lymond is bad.
Right. So Lymond, that's how he manipulated him, by just
oh, Lymond.
What's the phrase when you do that?
Reverse psychology.
Reverse psychology. So he just used reverse psychology on him. Okay. I was just trying to get all of that clear. Okay. So.
What did you think of Lymond's interactions with the Little Queen?
He was cute. They were cute. Like.
Now, he was there specifically to interact with her, right?
He was there to meet up with Christian.
Oh, that was an accident as well.
That was just an accident.
Yeah,
okay.
She wasn't supposed to be there. She got dragged along by her maid who was sneaking off to see a boy. And the maid left the queen alone while she went off to go talk to the boy.
And
all right.
quite notably, Lymond fell asleep. His head injury is still like causing him to randomly fall asleep in places in public, which is not very good for a wanted outlaw.
Right. And the queen like jumped on him or something.
He wakes up with the Little Queen bouncing on him, and then she like feeds him a fish, and he pretends to eat it, and then he just kind of body riddle.
Yeah, it was just adorable, and like which is interesting because in this time in history, kids, even royal kids, are not seen as actual people. Like children are not perceived as like people that you interact with in a meaningful way until they become adults or until they become older. So the fact that he sort of humored her and played with her was super sweet. Yeah.
So these chapters to me are some of my favorites in the series, and I think that they're kind of an anchor when Lymond does things that seem like beyond the pale, and when he does things that make you think he's a bad person. Like, you can look back at these chapters, assuming that the amnesia is real and that that's who he really is underneath that he's this like sweet and charming and like not malicious person. He's very honest and very honorable. Like, he tells Christian he's planning to escape, and he says he won't do it if she doesn't give permission. He tries to tell her who he is. He tries not to take advantage of her and use her for information about Crouch, even though she volunteers and she has access to that information. So like the quotations and the love of stories and the love of poetry and the love of music, it's interesting thing to keep coming back to and be like, okay, that's what's underneath it all. And it kind of is this like string woven through the series. And there's a scene in the third book, and then there's a quote where like Lymond has gone in a very different direction than any of these things, and then he says this quote, which if you've read the books, you know the quote I mean, and if you haven't, I won't say it because I don't want to spoil it. He says this quote about like who he really is, that like everything in that quote is in this scene. And it's extremely telling because we get this right at the beginning, and then we go in a very different direction for a long time. But this is like the thing to come back to.
I was also kind of intrigued with, I'd really love to know the music that they're singing in that scene, because like the modern version of particularly the song where he gets his memory back, the frog song, is a children's song. Like it's a sing song. Froggy went a courting and he did right. Like it's like this really happy sing-songy kids song today. And I just wonder, like, is that the tone? Like, was it a more serious song back then, or is it a fun, happy-go-lucky song? Because I think it's kind of cute if they're singing kids songs.
Oh, this is totally a kid song. So I love that you know the song because I've never heard the song. I only know it from this. It's in the Lymond poetry where there's a version of it. What happens to the frog in the version that you know?
Oh my gosh. Okay. You're asking me to go back like 40 years. Froggy in the court, he did right. Froggy in the court, he did right. Froggy in the court, he did right. Sword and rapier by his side. I think he dies. Like, I think it's one of those kid songs that's super bleak. Cause he goes courting and he has a rapier, something in a rapier by his side. Yeah, I'm sure he probably dies. Like,
yeah, so he goes courting, he meets a mouse. They meet what did they meet? They meet a rat who's gonna, I think, marry them.
yeah.
Then the cat comes and eats the mouse, and then the drake comes and eats the frog, and then the rat runs away, and that's the end.
Yeah, that seems like what the song says today too. Like,
and it's actually like also then raises a question of why does Lymond relate himself to this jolly courting frog that gets killed?
It gets killed, yeah.
Yeah, and what does that mean?
Like, all those kids songs that are so dark, you know, like Rockabye Baby, where the cradle like falls out of the tree, you know, or Ring Around the Rosie, that's not a happy song. Yeah, and yeah, so it's kind of like this happy-go-lucky, charming thing with like this kind of bleak underside.
This is the very important song for this book and the characters, but I won't say more than that.
Well, I don't want everyone to die.
Oh, of course not. Of course not.
Yeah, but I'm definitely, and so I'm trying to, one of my promises for this book is to read it as we go. So like I'm not, I didn't move past the chapters that we decided, but we are now on page 85 and I really wanted to read the next chapter. So we have hit that point, just so you know. So
I have a question for you two. What do you think? Do you think that there's a romantic spark between Lymond and Christian, or do you think it's just a friendship spark? Or is it different?
I was seeing it and reading it sort of as the beginning of a romance. Like if there is to be a romance for Lymond in these books, I could see it either being Christian Shepherd or Marietta. I don't know. I had that feeling as well. I don't necessarily think that he needs to have a romance for these books to be, interesting. But if that's the case, I can see that.
Yeah, I actually thought about this question as I was reading it, because I was like, is she setting up a romance between those two? And I thought about it a lot as I was reading those scenes. And I think the conclusion I came to is that the reason I think that is because I'm sort of conditioned to think that in narrative structure today. So like if a unattached man and an unattached woman who clearly have a mental connection, like a mental and or emotional connection, interact at the beginning of a story, well, then they're going to get together at some point in the story. And so, but I am not convinced that that's what's going to happen. I'd be fine with it if it did, but I think the reason I think that is just because I read a lot of romance, and yeah.
No, it makes sense. I agree. I think you're set up to think if this is a romance, then this might be the romance in it, but the question of genre is interesting. Like I said earlier, I think it's more of a mystery than a romance, and so in a way the romance is like a trick.
Right. And also, I would be disappointed if Marietta is a romance option for him. I think he is definitely an option for her. Like, she's clearly set up to be more interested in her brother-in-law than she is in her husband. I mean, her brother-in-law than her husband. She is much more intrigued by Lymond than she is by Richard. But I am hoping that he does not respond to that.
There's not a lot about Marietta that's would be interesting to someone like Lymond.
Yeah,
it's
kind of, I don't know. Basic.
What purpose do you guys think this chapter serves in the overall kind of shape of the book?
I mean, I think we've already discussed it. I definitely see it as setting up his softer side, setting up the fact that even though he is a bit of a rapscallion, he's got this lovable sort of caring nature about him, to show the duality for when things do happen later, which I have no idea what they might be, but you seem to insinuate that there's going to be some harder chapters where it's going to be harder to like what he's doing. So I think it's setting up that duality of his nature and showing that, yes, he is a well-rounded person.
And also, I think it's hard to know at this point. I feel like that's almost, it's a better question to ask at the end of the book than it is to ask now. Because, like, I don't know what the point of these chapters is yet. I don't got there. Like, I mean, it's kind of like, well, if he continues in this emotional character vein, then the point of these chapters is establishing this character in this way. If we begin to see him in more contrast, darker lights, more negative lights, etc., then it's giving us a glimpse into this piece of his character that we wouldn't see in other stories, So it's kind of like, we'll see what happens next. I don't know.
What do you guys think is going to happen next?
Just taking the context of the chapter, the whole chapter is called, I think it's the play for Jonathan Crouch. Yeah, the play for Jonathan Crouch. So I definitely think he's headed towards, I can't remember his name, I'm sorry, George? Was it George?
Douglas. Yeah.
Yes.
Henry Douglas?
Henry Douglas.
Henry Douglas.
No, it's George Douglas.
Oh, it is George Douglas. Sorry. So he's headed to George Douglas to, I guess, rescue Jonathan Crouch or take him prisoner himself? Because Jonathan Crouch is an Englishman, so.
What does Lymond want with?
That I don't know yet. I don't know why he's making this play for him, but it's part of his plan.
Yeah, I am wondering if he either has information that Lymond either wants or wants to prevent. Lymond either wants to get information from Crouch or wants to prevent Crouch from telling someone else something, or Crouch has some sort of value to somebody, so Lymond wants to trade him for something or get future favors for something. I feel like the English were far too easily dealt with in this chapter. It was like, woohoo, magic, they're going back south. And I feel like I'm a little suspicious that that's actually, in terms of what's going to happen next, I'm super suspicious that the English have been dealt with, mainly just because I know the English were the pain in the butt to the Scots up until, to today. So it's not like,
they're not gone for good, but this is a real historical thing that happened, was that they won the Battle of Pinkie and then they retreated, and I guess the historical opinion now is that if they had kept going, they probably would have taken Scotland then and there, but
right.
as they didn't, which they really didn't, yay.
Right. But because this is real, she does all these real historical events. Like, I feel like I don't know the details of the Scottish and English conflict. I just know that there was a lot of it, and it happened over a long period of time.
Oh yeah, it's fun for good.
Scotland is currently part of Great Britain and not its own country. So at some point, something happened, and so I feel like the whole "they retreated south" thing is not.
Yeah, it's not for good.
It's not for good. So I feel like maybe something, and I have a feeling that, so if I remember correctly, my very scant English history, so Elizabeth is going to become queen soon, like relatively soon. If Edward is king now,
you got Bloody Mary in the middle.
Yeah, Bloody Mary and then Elizabeth, but it doesn't take that long. It's like 15 years, something like that. And then Elizabeth is going to be queen until what? 1602, 1603, something like that. And then James the First takes over. And when James the First takes over, he's Scottish. So it's like we've got this up until the end of the 1500s, and then they're together. James the First of England was James the something else of Scotland. So
I often wonder what it would be like to read this as a Scottish person, because she wrote it as a Scottish person, and so like if you are Scottish, you probably know all this history, or much more of this history than American does, because we don't learn any world history.
We're so ignorant.
Yeah, terribly.
But one of the things that I found most interesting reading this, in terms of like the history that I learned, is so Mary Queen of Scots' mother, Marie de Guise, is French, and
right, which you can see that in the book. I mean, her language is French.
And to counterbalance the English influence on Scotland, the Scottish have this alliance with the French, obviously, like having married, and then
did they send Mary to France because she's supposed to marry the French king or something?
I don't want to spoil you for the book at this point.
I feel like this 4-year-old girl gets sent to France and either is betrothed to and or marries the heir to the French throne and or the king. I can't.
One of the things I learned from this that I didn't know before was the relationship between Scotland and the rest of Europe. That Scotland does have a lot of these ties. It was called the Old Alliance between Scotland and France, and you see it right now in contemporary politics, with Scotland being completely against Brexit and wanting to stay part of the European Union.
Right.
So like we see it in the history in this book, where they have this tight relationship with France to counterbalance the power of the English.
I mean, more than once, didn't like Scottish leaders sort of hide out in France and raise an army and then come back to Scotland and then lose and then like sort of lather, rinse, repeat?
Yeah, I literally don't want to spoil you for the book at this point, so I don't want to answer these questions.
I mean, I know historically what happens to Mary Queen of Scots in France, so I don't want to spoil it either, but I'm interested to see how it works.
Google what happened to her, like just what happened. Like, I have to say, American education is so sad.
I could be wrong, and I only got this knowledge from a movie because I was never taught this in school. But doesn't she marry like someone in French royalty, and then that person ends up dying pretty quickly?
Henry's, I think?
She comes right back to Scotland.
Yeah.
She comes back to Scotland and marries Lord Darnley, who's a shit.
Oh.
And that does not end well.
That's not good.
But he might be Lyman's illegitimate son, as we find out in this book.
Oh. Wow.
Okay. But it's a hint.
Oh. No, go ahead.
going back to the question of what we think will happen next, I don't necessarily know if this will happen, but I would like to see some sort of explanation as to why Lymond has an injury and why he was wearing sort of English colors or an English soldier's outfit.
Yeah, we have no, like, who hit him on the head?
Because at the end of the chapter before it is when he challenged Richard to meet him at Stirling.
Apparently still coming.
Popinjay, yes.
Yep. Yeah.
And then I don't know how much time has passed, but the next thing we see is he's this guy that washes up wearing an English costume. So I would like to figure out what happened in that time period, and I hope it's coming. So
also, you know what would really help me a little bit, I think? What year are we in? I just realized there's no, I'm looking through the book, there's no like January 1775, you know, like there's none of that. When are we?
We're in September 1547. The Battle of Pinkie was 10 September 1547.
yes, I just Googled it up. It is.
And there was reference in the first chapter to it being August, so it's like August, September. We're in the autumn.
So August 15 what?
47.
47.
Yeah.
Okay. Because that will help me. I need concrete like markers to put in my head for things. So the beginning of, so when Lymond washes up at Boghall, it's like September 1547.
Yep. And Hugh is particularly anti-English because they just lost the Battle of Pinkie, and I think Lord Fleming was killed in the battle.
Right. And poor Janet, who got stabbed in the, or Jenny, who got stabbed in the shoulder, is now a widow.
Yeah.
No, two different people. Jenny Fleming is a widow who's the Christian Stewart's godmother. Janet Buccleuch got stabbed in the shoulder. Not a widow.
Is she Will Scott's mom?
She's like his stepmom because she's married to his dad, but she's not his mother. She's his third wife.
Okay. So Janet got stabbed and is Will Scott's stepmom. Jenny is a widow and is Lymond's godmother.
Christian's godmother.
Christian's godmother. Oh my gosh!
Too many people.
Too many people. Does Lymond have a godmother?
Not that I know
I'm
of.
sure he does. Surely they did.
He's got mother. He's got Sibylla.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to happen? Anything based on these chapters? You're like, oh, I want to learn more about this, or I want to see more of this.
I just don't think I know enough of what's going on yet. I'd be able to answer that question later, I think.
I want to see more of like Lymond being wily and charming. That's what I would like to see more of that. I want to see this duel with his brother. I want to see that play out. Yeah. I'd like to see more of his men. Going back to the whole Robin Hood thing, you know, like I want to see Lymond and his merry men. You know.
Any final thoughts, comments, questions, etc.?
No, I am actually looking forward to reading onward. I wasn't so into it after the first part, the first two things that we read, because there's a lot that's happening and a lot of stuff that historically I just don't know anything about. But these chapters really helped ground things for me and like get me interested in moving forward more.
Well, and I feel like we just saw a little bit more of people, and a character is what's going to draw me into a story. Like, I'm just a reader who's character driven and not plot driven. Like, I'll read a book where two people sit in a chair at a coffee shop the entire novel and have a conversation, and I would be into that book, you know, where nothing happens. But so a whole bunch of things happening, I don't really care. Like, whatever. The army comes, the army goes, somebody gets murdered, whatever. But give me people that I care about and characters that I care about, and I'll read for 15 hours. So the fact that we got to see just more interaction, we got to see some sarcasm, we got to see some funny bits, we got to see, you know, like people being surprised, you know, like that kind of stuff. So yeah, I'm way more invested in, I'm still not sure I like everybody except for Christian, but I'm definitely more invested in the story.
I would gladly read an entire book that was just Lymond and Christian bantering and like your quotations
True.
playing music.
Down over coffee and bantering for 400 pages. I would read that.
Oh yeah. Well, on that note, thank you everyone.
Yay!
Thanks for having me.
It was fun.